There is a specific, suffocating kind of silence when a man walks away from you at the altar. It isn't punctuated by gasps or dramatic whispers. It is simply the sound of 300 people simultaneously holding their breath. Arlo didn't apologize. He merely adjusted his imported silk tie, looked at me with utterly dead eyes, and walked out of the cathedral. I didn't cry. I just stood there, smelling the faint, bitter trace of his cedar scent fading into the vaulted ceiling, already knowing deep in my bones that I was carrying his child. The air conditioning in St. Jude's Cathedral had been broken since early that morning. It was a suffocatingly hot Tuesday in June. Rich people loved midweek weddings. It was a flex of power, a quiet way of proving their time was worth more than anyone else's calendar. I was sweating beneath the collar of a white linen suit that cost more than my first car. Arlo had insisted on the tailor. He had insisted on the cathedral. He had insisted on everything right up until the moment the string quartet stopped playing. I stood at the altar, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I felt good. I felt secure. The air was thick with the scent of Casablanca lilies and the heavy, expensive perfumes of the Reynolds family and their shareholders sitting in the front rows. Arlo stepped up beside me. He didn't look at me. His posture was rigid, his shoulders locked beneath the dark charcoal fabric of his Tom Ford suit. He smelled like cedar and frost and Alpha's natural pheromones, but beneath it was something acrid. Ozone. Panic. "Arlo?" I murmured, keeping my voice pitched for him alone. The priest was opening his leather-bound book, clearing his throat. Arlo turned his head. His gray eyes, usually so sharp and appraising, looked hollowed out. He leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of my ear. The congregation likely thought he was whispering something romantic, a vow before the vows. "I can't do this, Leo," he whispered. His voice was entirely flat. I blinked. The heat in the church suddenly felt oppressive, pressing against my lungs. "What?" "The board voted this morning," Arlo said, his tone conversational, as if we were discussing quarterly earnings over black coffee. "If I bind myself to an omega with no equity, no familial backing, they'll trigger a no-confidence vote by Friday. My father has already drafted the paperwork to oust me. I have to marry the Collins heir. The merger depends on it." I stared at the side of his face. I watched a single drop of sweat trace down his temple, catching in the sharp line of his jaw. He wasn't joking. Arlo didn't have a sense of humor to begin with, but this was a different level of cold. He was looking at the stained glass window behind the altar, avoiding my eyes. "You're doing this now?" I asked. My voice didn't shake. I felt entirely detached from my own body, floating somewhere near the vaulted ceiling. "In front of 300 people? It had to be public," Arlo replied. "The board needed to see me sever the tie decisively, to prove my loyalty to the firm. A balance sheet. I was a liability on a balance sheet, and he was writing me off in real time." He took a half step back. The priest paused, his mouth hanging slightly open in confusion. In the front row, Arlo's father, a man with a face carved from granite and cruelty, leaned back in his pew. He didn't smile, but the tension left his shoulders. He had won. "I've instructed my assistant to wire your account a severance," Arlo said. The word severance hung between us, heavy and foul. "It will cover the embarrassment. Don't contact me." He turned around. The sound of his leather dress shoes clicking against the marble floor echoed through the cavernous room. He walked down the long, white carpet. He didn't look back. The heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral opened, spilling bright, blinding sunlight into the dim church, and then they shut. He was gone. The silence that followed was total. I could hear the faint buzz of a trapped fly near the altar. I could feel 300 pairs of eyes resting heavily on my shoulders. Pity, mockery, relief. I didn't collapse. I didn't scream. Omega instincts are deeply rooted in preserving the pack, but when the alpha abandons the bond before it is even sealed, the body goes into a strange, numbing shock. I turned to the priest. I offered him a tight, close-lipped smile. "I guess we're done here," I said quietly. I walked down the same aisle. I didn't run. I kept my chin perfectly level. I walked past the billionaires, the socialites, the people who had pretended to accept me for the last 2 years. I walked out into the sweltering heat of the city, flagged down a yellow cab, and went back to the apartment I had lived in before I met Arlo. 2 weeks later, the numbness faded, replaced by a vicious, exhausting flu. I couldn't keep water down. The scent of coffee made me double over the porcelain sink. I sat on the cold hexagonal tiles of my cramped bathroom, the buzzing fluorescent light flickering overhead. In my hand was a cheap plastic stick bought from a corner pharmacy. 2 harsh pink lines. I threw the test into the trash can. I rested my forehead against the cool edge of the bathtub, and for the first time since Arlo walked out of the church, I let out a jagged, ugly breath. I didn't cry for the lost love. I cried because of the sheer, terrifying inconvenience of the biology. He had left me for a merger, and I was keeping the collateral. 4 years is a long time if you are waiting for something. If you are just trying to survive, it passes in the blink of an exhausted eye. Dad, the toaster is smoking. I cracked one eye open. The morning light filtering through the cheap blinds of my Seattle apartment was gray and relentless. Standing by the side of my bed was Toby. He was 4 years old, wearing faded dinosaur pajamas, holding a completely charred piece of wheat bread on a paper plate. "I tried to make breakfast," Toby stated. He didn't sound apologetic. He sounded strictly factual. I sat up, dragging a hand down my face, feeling the rough stubble on my jaw. "Thank you, Tobe. Let's maybe leave the electrical appliances to me from now on, yeah?" "You were asleep," he pointed out logically. I looked at him, and the familiar, dull ache settled in my chest. It was entirely unfair how genetics worked. Toby had nothing of me. He had Arlo's unruly dark hair. He had Arlo's sharp, piercing gray eyes. Even at 4, he had a quiet, calculating way of looking at the world that felt completely alpha. He didn't throw tantrums. He observed. He analyzed. "I'm awake now," I said, swinging my legs out of bed. Life was a grind, but it was a quiet one. I worked as a bookkeeper for Pioneer Salvage, a mid-sized architectural reclamation company located in the industrial district. We tore down old warehouses, stripped the brick, reclaimed the timber, and sold it to hipsters building overpriced coffee shops. It wasn't glamorous. My desk was in a corrugated metal office that smelled permanently of rust, sawdust, and wet concrete. It was perfect. The harsh industrial smells easily overpowered the subtle, sweet scent of an unbonded Omega. I took my scent blockers religiously every morning with my coffee, pushing my biology down into a dark, locked box. I got Toby dressed, packed his lunch in a dented metal tin, and walked him 3 blocks in the light drizzle to his daycare. "I'm picking you up at 5, I told him, kneeling down to zip up his rain jacket. "Liam said he was picking me up," Toby corrected, fixing his gray eyes on mine. "Liam has to check a demolition site today. It's me." Toby nodded once, accepting the updated itinerary. "Okay, can we get macaroni for dinner?" "If you don't burn the kitchen down first." I gave him a quick hug, breathing in his scent. Warm milk, rain, and a faint, developing undercurrent of clean wood. My anchor. I walked the remaining 6 blocks to Pioneer Salvage. The office was loud, phones were ringing, the heavy machinery in the yard was roaring, and Liam, the site foreman, was yelling at someone over a 2-way radio. Liam was a beta, broad-shouldered, permanently covered in a thin layer of brick dust, and fiercely loyal. He had hired me 3 years ago when I walked in looking for an accounting job, dragging a toddler by the hand. He had never asked questions about the father. "You're late," Liam grunted as I walked in, tossing a heavy ledger onto my desk. "Toby attempted arson via the toaster," I replied, booting up my ancient desktop computer. "What's the panic?" Liam ran a hand over his shaved head. "The old man sold us out. The owner. He accepted a buyout last night. Entire block is getting leveled for a new tech campus." I stopped typing my password. A cold prickle of unease washed over the back of my neck. A buyout? Who bought it? Some massive conglomerate out of Chicago. Reynolds Group or something. They're sending a transition team today to audit the books. They want us out in 30 days. The name dropped into my stomach like a lead weight. Reynolds Group. I stared at the flickering monitor. It was a massive company, a global empire. They owned real estate, tech, pharmaceuticals, shipping. Arlo was the CEO now. His father had passed away 2 years ago. I had read the short, sterile obituary in the Financial Times. "Arlo won't be here," I told myself, deliberately unclamping my jaw. He sits in a glass tower 50 stories above Chicago. He doesn't visit dirty salvage yards in Seattle. He sends junior associates, vultures in cheap suits. "When is the team getting here?" I asked, forcing my fingers to resume typing. 20 minutes, Liam grumbled, pouring a mug of black coffee. "Make sure the books look pretty, Leo. These corporate pricks look for any excuse to deny severance pay. The books are spotless," I said defensively. I spent the next 20 minutes pulling files, printing out the last 3/4 of profit and loss statements. I felt a strange, vibrating energy under my skin. It was just a coincidence. Corporate acquisitions happened every day. I was safe here, buried under the rain and the sawdust. Then I heard the sound of a luxury town car pulling onto the gravel lot outside. The heavy tires crunched slowly, coming to a halt. I didn't look out the window. I kept my eyes on the spreadsheet. The corrugated metal door of the office groaned open. The smell of the yard, wet dirt, diesel, and rust, spilled in, but it was immediately chased by something else. It was sharp. It was cold. It cut through the heavy air of the office like a straight razor. Cedar wood and bitter frost. It was an alpha scent, completely unsuppressed, dominating the small room in a matter of seconds. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't look up. I couldn't. "Who's in charge here?" a voice asked. It was deeper than I remembered, rougher around the edges, lacking the polished, rehearsed cadence of the man who had stood at the altar, but the underlying steel was exactly the same. Arlo was here. I kept my head down, staring intently at cell C42 on the monitor. It took every ounce of discipline I possessed not to physically flinch. Liam stepped forward, wiping his dusty hands on his jeans. That would be me. Liam, foreman. You the audit team? I am the CEO of Reynolds Group, Arlo's voice replied. The arrogance was casual, deeply ingrained. I prefer to inspect my acquisitions personally when the profit margins are this far below standard real estate value. Where are the financial records? He does this personally now, I thought, my heart hammering a brutal rhythm against my ribs. Since when does Arlo Reynolds care about a $2 million salvage yard? Bookkeeper has them, Liam said, gesturing toward the back of the room. Leo, bring the quarterly reports up. There was no escaping it. I took a slow, deliberate breath, mentally locking away the panic. I was not 22 anymore. I was not wearing white linen. I was 26, wearing a faded gray sweater and sensible boots. And I had kept a human being alive for 4 years. I picked up the manila folders and stood up. I walked toward the front of the office. Arlo was standing near the door. He was wearing a dark navy coat over a bespoke suit. He looked older. The 4 years had aged him beautifully, carving sharper lines into his face. But there was a dark exhaustion bruising the skin under his gray eyes. He looked like a man who hadn't slept properly since the day I met him. He was looking at Liam, waiting for the files. I stopped 3 feet away from him. I held out the folders. Here are the last 3 quarters, Mr. Reynolds. Arlo's hand reached out to take them. His eyes shifted from Liam to me. The files dropped. They hit the dirty concrete floor with a loud, chaotic slap, papers sliding out in a messy fan. Arlo didn't look at the papers. He was staring at me. His pupils blew wide, swallowing the gray of his irises. The scent in the room spiked violently, the cedar turning aggressive, heavy, thick with shock. For 5 seconds, the office was entirely silent. The hum of the space heater in the corner sounded like a jet engine. Leo, he breathed. The word wasn't spoken. It was torn out of his throat. I looked at him with an expression of mild, professional irritation. I didn't smile. I didn't scowl. I gave him the exact same look I gave the delivery drivers who brought the wrong grade of lumber. You dropped the P&L reports, I said, my voice steady, flat, and completely devoid of warmth. I didn't bend down to pick them up. Arlo took a step forward, invading my personal space. His height was imposing, but I held my ground. His chest was rising and falling rapidly. What are you doing here? I work here, I said plainly. I'm the bookkeeper. As you can see, you are currently disrupting my workspace. Liam looked between us, his brow furrowing. You guys know each other? No, I said instantly. Yes, Arlo barked at the exact same time. He didn't take his eyes off me. He looked frantic, like a man seeing a ghost that he had personally buried. Leo, where have you been? I've had private investigators looking. I really don't have time for personal anecdotes, Mr. Reynolds, I cut him off, my voice turning to ice. We have 30 days to liquidate this site. Unless you need me to walk you through the amortization schedule, I have a job to do. I turned on my heel and walked back to my desk. I sat down. I pulled the keyboard toward me and began to type nonsense into the spreadsheet. Arlo followed me. He bypassed the low counter, ignoring Liam's bark of protest, and marched right up to my desk. He slammed his hands down on the cheap laminate wood, leaning over me. Do not turn your back on me, he growled low. an alpha command dripping with authority. It might have worked on me 4 years ago. Now, it just pissed me off. I slowly rolled my chair back, looking up at him. You left me standing at an altar in front of 300 people so you could marry a balance sheet, I said, keeping my voice hushed so the rest of the office wouldn't hear. You gave up your right to demand anything from me the second you walked out of that church. You don't get to use that tone with me. Not ever again. Arlo's jaw tightened. A flash of profound pain crossed his features, quickly masked by anger. You don't understand what happened. The merger. I don't care, I interrupted softly. I truly, deeply do not care, Arlo. You made your choice. You secured your empire. Congratulations. Now get out of my office. He opened his mouth to speak, but the vibration of a cell phone cut through the tension. It was mine, sitting on the desk. A text message lit up the screen. Liam's name. Wait, Liam was standing right there. No, it was a text from the daycare. Automatic alert. Power outage in building. Please pick up your child immediately. I swore under my breath. I grabbed the phone, shoved it into my pocket, and stood up, grabbing my coat from the back of the chair. I'm leaving, I told Liam across the room. Emergency at the daycare. Go, Liam said immediately, stepping forward to block Arlo. I'll handle the suit. You're not walking away from this, Arlo said, trying to step around Liam. His eyes were wild. Leo, we are talking about this. There is nothing to talk about, I said, pushing past him toward the door. I tore the city apart looking for you, Arlo shouted, the carefully maintained facade of the billionaire CEO finally cracking. I annulled the Collins marriage 2 years ago. I stepped up as CEO, and I spent millions trying to find you. I paused at the door, my hand on the metal handle. I looked back at him over my shoulder. You should have kept the money, Arlo. It's the only thing that won't ever leave you. I shoved the door open and walked out into the rain. I power walked the 6 blocks to the daycare. My hands were shaking. The adrenaline was leaving my system, leaving me cold and nauseous. I had survived the encounter. I had kept my secret. Arlo would leave. He was too proud to stay and be spoken to like that. I arrived at the daycare. The lights were out. The frantic teachers were handing kids off to annoyed parents in the lobby. Leo, Ms. Patel called out, waving a flashlight. Toby's right here. Toby was sitting on a plastic chair, calmly reading a picture book in the dim light, seemingly unfazed by the chaos around him. Hey, buddy, I breathed, scooping him up into my arms. He felt solid, real, grounding me instantly. Power's out. We're going back to my office for an hour until I finish up, okay? Did the toaster do it? Toby asked seriously. No, Toby. The toaster didn't take down the city grid. I chuckled weakly, burying my face in his neck for a brief second. I carried him out. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflective. I carried him all the way back to the salvage yard, my mind racing. I just needed to grab my hard drive, pack up my personal items, and quit. I could find another job. I couldn't be anywhere near Reynolds' group. We approached the corrugated metal office building. The black town car was still there. I froze. He didn't leave. I put Toby down on the gravel. Okay, stay right by my leg. We're just going in and out. I pushed the door open. Arlo was standing by the window, his back to us, arguing heatedly with Liam. He turned around at the sound of the door opening. The angry tirade died on his lips. He looked at me, and then his gaze dropped down to my side. Toby stood there, holding my hand. He was wearing his yellow rain boots and a dark blue coat. He looked up at the strange man in the expensive suit. Toby blinked. Arlo stopped breathing. I watched the exact moment the billionaire's brain short-circuited. Arlo looked at the 4-year-old boy. He looked at the boy's dark hair. He looked at the shape of the boy's jaw. And then he met the boy's piercing, analytical gray eyes. Eyes that were an exact, terrifying mirror of his own. The heavy cedar scent in the room vanished, replaced by the sharp, suffocating smell of absolute devastation. Arlo's knees gave out. He didn't fall completely, catching himself heavily on the edge of Liam's desk, his knuckles turning white. He stared at Toby, his chest heaving, his mouth working silently, before he finally managed to push a single, fractured word into the quiet room. Mine? Mine? The word hung in the damp air of the office, frail and desperate. Arlo was still clutching the edge of Liam's desk, his knuckles stark white. He looked as though he had been physically struck, his broad chest rising and falling in shallow, frantic hitches. The polished, impenetrable armor of the Reynolds Group CEO had entirely shattered, leaving behind a hollowed-out man staring at a ghost he didn't know he had created. I stepped in front of Toby, breaking the line of sight. I moved purely on instinct, my shoulder angled defensively, effectively shielding my son from the alpha. The scent in the room was a chaotic mess, my own suppressed omega distress leaking through the blockers, mixing with Arlo's overwhelming panic and cedar. "Leo!" Arlo choked out. He took a staggering step forward, reaching a hand out. "Leo, is he—" "Do not take another step toward us," I said. My voice was eerily calm, the kind of quiet that precedes a devastating storm. Arlo froze, his hand suspended in the space between us, trembling slightly. "He has my eyes," he whispered, staring at the sliver of Toby's face visible from behind my leg. "He has my... God. How old is he?" "That is none of your business," I replied flatly. Toby tugged on the hem of my sweater. I glanced down. He was looking at Arlo with that analytical, unflinching stare. "Dad," Toby said, his voice loud in the quiet room, "is that the corporate prick who bought the yard?" Liam let out a sharp, choked cough from the corner, quickly turning it into a throat-clearing noise. Arlo flinched. The insult didn't register. Only the word Dad did. The sound of it seemed to carve a physical groove into his chest. He looked at me, his gray eyes shining with an unshed, frantic moisture. "You didn't tell me," Arlo said, the accusation bleeding through the shock. "You let me believe you were just gone. You hid my son from me." The audacity of it snapped the last thread of my patience. The numbness evaporated, replaced by a blinding white-hot fury. I took a step toward him, forcing him to instinctively take a half-step back. "I didn't hide anything," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "You left. You turned your back on me at the altar. You handed me off to your assistant like a fired employee, and you explicitly told me not to contact you. I followed your exact instructions, Arlo. I ceased to exist in your world. You don't get to stand here, 4 years later, and play the victim of a silence you demanded." Arlo opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The color had completely drained from his face. He looked down at the dirty concrete floor, the reality of his own actions finally dropping like an anvil onto his shoulders. "I didn't know," he managed to say, his voice cracking. "If I had known you were carrying—" "What?" I interrupted, a harsh, humorless laugh escaping my chest. "You would have married me? You would have let your father, and the board oust you? No, Arlo. You would have paid me off. You would have sent a team of lawyers to secure custody of the Reynolds heir, while keeping the inconvenient, penniless Omega out of the picture. I spared us both the litigation. He shook his head rapidly, a visceral denial. No, I wouldn't have. I would have torn the board apart. It's real easy to say that now, standing in a dirty salvage yard, I countered coldly. It was a lot harder when the cathedral was full and the stock prices were on the line. I turned back to Toby, scooping him up into my arms. He wrapped his legs around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. He stared at Arlo over my back. We are leaving, I told Liam. I didn't look at Arlo again. I'll be in tomorrow to finish the liquidation files. Take your time, Leo, Liam said quietly, stepping forward to casually place his large frame between me and the billionaire. I walked out of the office. The cold Seattle rain had started up again, misting the air. I walked fast, my boots crunching on the gravel. I expected to hear the heavy slam of the door, to hear Arlo chasing after me, throwing his weight and his money around. But there was only silence. When I reached the end of the block, I finally glanced back over my shoulder. Arlo was standing in the doorway of the office. He wasn't moving. He was just watching us disappear into the gray fog, looking like a man who had just watched his entire empire burn to the ground. The problem with billionaires is that they do not understand the concept of a closed door. They view a boundary merely as a negotiation tactic. I expected Arlo to send lawyers. I expected a black SUV to pull up outside my cheap apartment building with a court summons. I spent 3 sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, mentally cataloging my meager savings, wondering how long I could afford a defense attorney against the limitless coffers of Reynolds Group. But the lawyers never came. Arlo came instead. It started on a Tuesday. I was walking Toby back from daycare, the usual gray drizzle soaking into our coats. When we turned the corner onto our street, I saw a brand new, terrifyingly expensive Range Rover parked illegally in front of our building. Arlo was leaning against the hood. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit today. He wore a dark, heavy wool sweater and jeans, though the casual clothes probably cost more than my annual salary. He looked exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent, and he had a slight tremor in his hands. I stopped walking. Toby gripped my hand tighter. Leo, Arlo said, pushing off the car. He kept his distance, staying a respectful 10 feet away. Please don't run. I just want to talk. I have nothing to say to you, I replied, pulling out my keys. Move your car before it gets towed. I bought the building, Arlo said quietly. I froze, the key halfway to the lock. I turned my head slowly, staring at him. Excuse me? Your landlord accepted an aggressive buyout this morning, Arlo explained, his tone completely devoid of its usual arrogance. He sounded almost apologetic. I didn't do it to trap you. I did it because the security on this front door is a joke, and the heating system is ancient. I have a crew coming tomorrow to replace the boiler and install secure locks. Your rent is permanently waived. I looked at him, feeling a deep, vibrating surge of nausea. This was how he operated. He couldn't buy my forgiveness, so he was buying my environment. Sell it back, I said evenly, or I will pack our bags tonight and disappear to a city where you will never find us. Panic flared instantly in his gray eyes. No, Leo, please. I won't interfere. I won't even come inside. I need to know he's warm. I need to know you're safe. Please. We were perfectly safe before you decided to play real estate god, I snapped. I unlocked the door and pushed Toby inside. Go upstairs, buddy. Turn on the TV. Toby looked at Arlo, then at me, and obediently marched up the stairs. I stepped back out onto the stoop, pulling the door shut behind me. The rain was getting heavier, plastering my hair to my forehead. Arlo stood in the downpour, making no move to get an umbrella. You think this fixes it? I asked, my voice cutting through the sound of the rain. You think buying a crumbling brick building in Seattle erases the fact that you left me to face 300 people alone? You think a new boiler makes up for 4 years of me working 50-hour weeks just to afford asthma medication for your son? Arlo flinched violently at the word son. He squeezed his eyes shut, water running down his face. No, he whispered. I know it doesn't fix it. I know money doesn't fix this. I have spent the last 2 years realizing that my money is the most useless thing I possess. He opened his eyes, and the raw agony in them was startling. I left you because my father convinced me that love was a vulnerability. He told me that if I married an Omega without backing, the board would devour me. I was terrified, Leo. I chose power over you. And the second the cathedral door shut behind me, I knew I had made the greatest mistake of my life. Then why didn't you turn around? I asked, the old, bitter wound throbbing in my chest. Pride, cowardice, Arlo admitted, his voice breaking. And by the time my father died and I finally had absolute control, you were gone. The private investigators couldn't find you. You changed your name. I went back to my mother's maiden name, I corrected coldly. It wasn't a master spy tactic, Arlo. You just didn't look hard enough. He took a step forward, his hands opening in a gesture of pure surrender. I am looking now. I am right here. I annulled the marriage to the Collins heir a month after the wedding. I haven't slept with anyone since you. I have been entirely hollowed out, Leo. Just let me earn it. Let me prove I'm not that man anymore. I stared at him. The rain soaked through my thin coat, chilling me to the bone. He looked pathetic. He looked broken. But the memory of his dead, empty eyes at the altar was still burned into the back of my eyelids. You want to prove something? I asked quietly. Prove you can respect my wishes. Leave us alone. I turned, walked into the building, and locked the door behind me. Through the frosted glass, I watched Arlo stand in the pouring rain for another hour before he finally got into his car and drove away. A week later, the reality of the salvage yard buyout set in. We had 10 days left to clear the massive lot. Liam was frantic, running a skeleton crew of guys trying to load tons of reclaimed timber and brick onto flatbed trucks. I was in the yard, wearing thick canvas gloves, helping catalog a pallet of Victorian-era stained glass windows. Toby was sitting on a sturdy wooden crate a safe distance away, happily drawing in a sketchbook with a set of extremely expensive architectural markers that had mysteriously appeared in our mailbox 2 days prior. I had tried to throw them away, but Toby had guarded them with a terrifying, silent ferocity. A heavy diesel engine rumbled, and a flatbed truck backed into the yard. Liam was shouting instructions over the noise, trying to guide a massive 600-pound oak support beam onto the bed using a forklift. Suddenly, the forklift's hydraulic line hissed violently, spraying a fine mist of fluid into the air. The machine shuddered and died. The oak beam was resting precariously on the edge of the flatbed, halfway on, halfway off. "Damn it!" Liam roared, kicking the tire of the forklift. "We need to push it manually before it slides off and crushes the suspension. Hey, I need 2 more guys over here now." The yard was mostly empty. The other crew members were on the far side of the lot. I pulled off my gloves and started jogging toward him, though I knew my weight wouldn't be enough to budge a beam that massive. Before I could reach the truck, a figure stepped out from the shadow of the corrugated metal office. Arlo. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie. He must have been standing inside the office, watching us through the dirty window. Without a single word, he shrugged out of his suit jacket and tossed it carelessly onto a pile of muddy bricks. He ripped the silk tie from his neck, dropping it in the dirt. He walked up to the flatbed truck, rolling up his pristine white sleeves, exposing thick, muscular forearms. Liam stared at him in utter disbelief. "What the hell are you doing, suit?" "Pushing," Arlo said simply. He stepped up to the massive oak beam, wedging his shoulder against the rough, splintered wood. "On 3. "You're gonna ruin a $5,000 suit, man," Liam warned, though he quickly moved to position his own shoulder next to Arlo's. "I don't care about the suit," Arlo grunted, his boots digging into the wet, muddy gravel. 1, 2, 3. I watched, stunned into stillness, as the billionaire CEO of Reynolds Group threw his entire weight against a filthy piece of reclaimed timber. The veins in his neck bulged. The sharp, bitter scent of alpha exertion flooded the air, entirely masking the smell of diesel. With a deafening scrape, the heavy beam slid fully onto the flatbed. Arlo stumbled forward slightly as the resistance vanished. He caught himself against the dirty metal side of the truck. His white shirt was smeared with thick black grease and mud. A massive, jagged splinter had torn through the fabric near his bicep, leaving a long, bleeding scratch down his arm. He didn't brush himself off. He didn't complain. He just stepped back, breathing heavily, and looked at Liam. "Do you need help with the next one?" Liam stared at him for a long moment, then slowly shook his head. "No, we're good. Thanks. Reynolds." Arlo nodded. He turned around to retrieve his ruined jacket. That was when Toby walked over. I sucked in a breath, stepping forward to intervene, but stopped. Toby was holding something in his small hand. He walked right up to Arlo's muddy boots and looked up. Arlo froze. He looked down at the boy, his chest heaving, terrified to make a sudden movement. Toby held out a brightly colored dinosaur print Band-Aid. "You're bleeding," Toby stated in his usual factual, emotionless tone. "You lack spatial awareness." A bizarre, choked sound escaped Arlo's throat. It was half laugh, half sob. He slowly, carefully lowered himself to one knee, uncaring that the mud was instantly soaking through his expensive trousers. He brought himself down to Toby's eye level. "Thank you," Arlo whispered, his voice incredibly thick. His hands were shaking as he reached out, carefully taking the Band-Aid from Toby's small fingers. Their skin brushed for a fraction of a second. Arlo closed his eyes. A single tear escaped, tracking through the dirt on his cheek. He stayed there, kneeling in the mud, clutching a plastic Band-Aid like it was the most valuable asset he had ever acquired. Toby watched him cry with mild curiosity, then turned and trotted back to his wooden crate to resume drawing. Arlo opened his eyes and looked up at me. He was dirty, bleeding, and stripped of all his corporate armor. He didn't look like the man at the altar anymore. He looked entirely, deeply human. I stared back at him. My chest felt tight. The impenetrable wall of anger I had relied on for 4 years didn't break. I wasn't ready to forgive him. The trauma of the altar was still a heavy, suffocating weight. But as I watched Arlo press a dinosaur Band-Aid against his bleeding arm in the middle of a muddy salvage yard, I felt the ice inside me crack. Just a millimeter. But it cracked. Arlo did not leave Seattle. He simply became a fixture of the city's gray landscape, like the relentless drizzle or the fog rolling off the Puget Sound. He didn't hover, and he didn't intrude. He parked his absurdly expensive car down the street from my apartment building. I would see him sitting behind the steering wheel at 6 in the morning when I walked out to get the paper, nursing a cup of cheap bodega coffee. He never approached. He just watched us walk to daycare, ensuring we arrived safely, and then he drove away. At the salvage yard, his presence was equally phantom-like. The Reynolds Group transition team finished their audit, and the 30-day eviction notice ticked down. Arlo didn't try to miraculously reverse the sale. That would have required board approval and caused a media circus. Instead, a shell company mysteriously purchased an abandoned, heavily subsidized industrial lot in the south end of the city and offered it to Liam for a fraction of the market lease rate. Liam knew exactly what was happening. He wasn't stupid, but he also had a crew of 20 men who needed to feed their families, so he signed the paperwork, swallowed his pride, and moved Pioneer Salvage to the new site. I moved with them. My desk was now in a slightly cleaner, slightly less drafty brick office. It was progress. It was breathing room. And then, as life often does when you finally catch your breath, the bottom fell out. It happened in late October. The damp cold of the Pacific Northwest had settled deep into the bones of the city. I woke up at 2 in the morning to a sound that instantly spiked my adrenaline, flooding my system with pure, panicked omega instinct. It was a high-pitched, rattling wheeze. I threw off the blankets and sprinted across the narrow hallway into Toby's room. The small nightlight cast a pale blue glow over his bed. Toby was sitting up, his small hands clutching the collar of his pajamas. His chest was heaving violently, retracting deep at the ribs. His lips had a terrifying faint, bluish tint. "Toby!" I gasped, dropping to my knees beside the bed. I grabbed his rescue inhaler from the nightstand, my hand shaking so badly I dropped the plastic cap. "Here, baby, breathe. Just like we practiced. Look at me." I pressed the spacer to his mouth and pumped the albuterol. Toby tried to inhale, but his airway was too tight. He coughed, a wet, horrifying sound, and gagged on the medicine. He looked at me, his gray eyes wide with a silent, absolute terror. He couldn't get the air in. Okay, we're going to the hospital," I said. My voice was eerily steady, the product of sheer, overriding parental panic. I didn't bother changing out of my sweatpants. I grabbed a thick blanket, wrapped it tightly around his small body, and scooped him up. He felt completely limp, his weight pulling heavily against my chest. I grabbed my keys and my phone, dialing 911 as I ran down the 2 flights of stairs, nearly tripping in the dark stairwell. "Emergency services," a calm voice answered. "My son is having a severe asthma attack. He's turning blue," I practically shouted, kicking the heavy front door of the apartment building open. "I need an ambulance. 442 East Mercer Street." Units are currently dispatched on a multi-car pileup on I-5, sir. The estimated arrival time for an ambulance is 15 minutes. Are you able to transport? 15 minutes. He didn't have 15 minutes. He didn't have 5. I stood on the wet pavement, the freezing rain instantly soaking through my thin shirt. I looked frantically up and down the empty, dark street. I didn't own a car. The nearest hospital was 3 miles away. Down the block, a pair of headlights flicked on. The heavy, aggressive roar of a V8 engine shattered the quiet of the neighborhood. The black Range Rover tore down the street, tires hydroplaning slightly on the slick asphalt before slamming to a violent halt right in front of the stoop. Arlo threw the driver's side door open. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing an unbuttoned Henley and sweatpants. He had been sleeping in his car. He took one look at Toby's blue lips and my frantic face. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. "Get in!" Arlo barked. The Alpha command wasn't directed at me. It was directed at the universe. It was a roar of absolute authority. I scrambled into the passenger seat, pulling the door shut. Before my seatbelt was even clicked, Arlo floored the accelerator. The heavy SUV fishtailed slightly before gripping the road, tearing through a red light. "Keep him upright. Keep his airway aligned," Arlo ordered, his voice remarkably calm, though the heavy, suffocating scent of terrified cedar filled the cabin. His hands gripped the steering wheel with bone-crushing force. "He's not pulling air, Arlo," I choked out, holding Toby's face against my neck. I could feel his heart hammering against my collarbone like a trapped bird. "He's not breathing right." Arlo laid heavily on the horn, blasting through another intersection, narrowly dodging a delivery truck. "We are 2 minutes away. Hold on, Leo. Just hold on to him." We hit the emergency room drop-off zone at 60 miles an hour. Arlo slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming against the concrete. He was out of the car before it even fully settled, abandoning it directly in front of the sliding glass doors with the engine still running. He ran around to my side, yanking the door open. He didn't try to take Toby from me. He just put a large, heavy hand on my back and pushed me through the doors. "Pediatric respiratory failure!" Arlo bellowed the second we crossed the threshold, his voice echoing off the sterile walls of the triage waiting room. "We need a doctor right now." The nurses took one look at Toby's color and immediately sprang into action. A gurney appeared. They pulled Toby from my arms. I tried to follow them through the double doors into the trauma bay, but a nurse put a firm hand on my chest. "Sir, you need to stay here. We've got him," she said, before disappearing through the heavy swinging doors. I stood in the middle of the bright, fluorescently lit waiting room. My arms were empty. The cold air conditioning hit my wet clothes, and a violent, uncontrollable shivering took over my body. My knees buckled. I didn't hit the linoleum floor. Arlo caught me. He wrapped his arms around my chest from behind, pulling my back flush against his broad chest. He lowered us both down to a row of plastic waiting room chairs, pulling me into the seat beside him. He didn't say a word. He just took my freezing, shaking hands in his warm ones and held on with a desperate, crushing grip. We sat there for 2 hours. The silence between us was heavy, thick with the shared terror of the unknown. Arlo didn't try to make small talk. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He sat rigidly, staring at the double doors, his jaw locked. Every time a doctor walked past, his entire body tensed, ready to spring. Finally, A pediatrician in light blue scrubs pushed through the doors, looking around the room. I stood up so fast the plastic chair scraped loudly against the floor. Arlo stood right beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. "Toby's parents?" the doctor asked. Arlo didn't correct him. Neither did I. "Yes," I breathed. "He's stabilized," the doctor smiled gently. "It was a severe bronchial spasm, exacerbated by a minor chest infection he was hiding. We have him on a continuous nebulizer and intravenous steroids. His oxygen saturation is back up to 98%. He's exhausted, but he's going to be absolutely fine." My vision swam. A choked, ragged sob tore its way out of my throat before I could stop it. I covered my face with my hands, my shoulders shaking violently as the adrenaline finally crashed, leaving behind pure, overwhelming relief. Arlo's arms wrapped around me. This time, I didn't push him away. I leaned into him, burying my face against his shoulder. He smelled like sweat, old coffee, and the sharp, clean scent of cedar. He held me tightly, burying his face in my hair. I could feel his chest heaving, his own silent tears dampening the collar of my shirt. "He's okay," Arlo whispered fiercely against my temple, his voice cracking. "He's okay, Leo. I've got you. I've got you both." For the first time in 4 years, I actually believed him. Toby spent 2 nights in the pediatric ward for observation. Arlo never left the hospital. He paid for a private corner suite with an absurd view of the Seattle skyline. He arranged for hot, decent food to be delivered to the room. But he didn't intrude. He spent the majority of the 48 hours sitting in the hallway outside the room, working on a sleek silver laptop, guarding the door like a silent sentinel. When Toby was finally discharged, he was pale, but in high spirits, clutching a stuffed gray wolf that Arlo had quietly asked a nurse to bring from the gift shop. Arlo drove us home. He carried Toby up the 2 flights of stairs, gently setting him down on the worn sofa in our living room. He lingered by the door, clearly waiting to be dismissed. "Stay," I said quietly, taking my coat off. Arlo blinked, his hand freezing on the brass doorknob. "Are you sure?" "He likes you," I pointed out, gesturing to Toby, who was currently forcing the stuffed wolf to fight a plastic Tyrannosaurus Rex. "And I'm too tired to fight you today. Do you want coffee?" Arlo let go of the doorknob. He looked as though I had just offered him the sun. "Yes, please." I went into the small kitchen, turning on the old drip machine. Arlo stood in the doorway, watching me with a quiet, intense focus. He looked exhausted, the lines around his mouth deeply etched. "The hospital billing department said the account was zeroed out," I said, leaning against the counter. "I didn't authorize that." "I did," Arlo replied instantly. "Leo, please don't argue with me on this. It's pocket change to the company, and I am not letting you drain your savings for my son's medical care." I looked down at the linoleum floor. "I'm tired, Arlo. I'm so incredibly tired of doing this by myself." It was the most honest I had been with him. It was the most vulnerable I had allowed myself to be. Arlo crossed the small kitchen, stopping just inches away from me. He didn't touch me, but the warmth radiating from his body was a physical comfort. "You don't have to," he said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone. "Let me take the weight. I don't care if you never forgive me. I don't care if you hate me for the rest of your life. Just let me provide for you. Let me make sure he never goes to an emergency room without the best doctors waiting at the door. Let me be his father." Before I could answer, a sharp, authoritative knock hammered on the apartment door. We both turned. I frowned. I wasn't expecting anyone. Liam usually texted before coming over. Arlo's eyes darkened. His spine straightened, the alpha instincts immediately flaring. He walked out of the kitchen and opened the front door. Standing in the hallway was a man in his late 50s, wearing an immaculate, tailored three-piece suit. He held an expensive leather briefcase. Flanking him were two massive men in dark suits. Corporate security. I recognized the man instantly from the financial magazines. Harrison Vance. He was the chairman of the Reynolds Group Board of Directors. He was the man who, alongside Arlo's father, had engineered the ultimatum at my wedding. Arlo's entire demeanor changed in a fraction of a second. The vulnerable, exhausted man vanished. In his place stood the ruthless, terrifying CEO of a global empire. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "What the hell are you doing here, Harrison?" Arlo demanded, his voice dangerously soft. Harrison offered a tight, predatory smile, stepping halfway into the apartment without an invitation. His eyes swept over the cheap furniture, dismissing it instantly before locking onto me. He then looked at Toby on the couch. "We need to have a conversation, Arlo," Harrison said smoothly. "The board has been monitoring your erratic behavior over the last month, liquidating assets, disappearing to Seattle, purchasing useless salvage yards, and now a private investigator has confirmed the rumors." Harrison pointed a manicured finger toward Toby. "You have an illegitimate heir. With the unbonded Omega, you were specifically instructed to discard." Arlo stepped directly into Harrison's personal space, forcing the older man to crane his neck back. "You have exactly 5 seconds to remove your hand from my doorframe before I break it." Harrison's smile faltered, but he held his ground. "Don't be dramatic, Arlo. We are here to protect the firm's interests. The Collins merger is still a viable option if you return to Chicago. As for the child, the board is prepared to offer a substantial trust fund, full financial support. In exchange, the Omega signs a non-disclosure agreement and relinquishes all claims to the Reynolds name. The boy stays hidden, a quiet asset." I felt the blood drain from my face. History was repeating itself. The boardroom was once again intruding into my life, demanding that I be erased for the sake of a stock ticker. I looked at Arlo, my chest tightening. "What are you going to do?" Arlo didn't hesitate. He didn't look back at me with dead eyes. He didn't flinch. He moved with terrifying speed. Arlo grabbed Harrison by the lapels of his expensive suit, hoisting the older man physically off the ground and slamming him backward into the hallway wall. The heavy thud rattled the cheap light fixtures. The two security guards instinctively reached inside their jackets, but Arlo shot them a look of such absolute, dominant alpha rage that they both froze in place, their instincts screaming at them to stand down. "Listen to me very carefully, Harrison," Arlo snarled, his voice a lethal, vibrating growl. "I am not the 24-year-old coward you and my father manipulated. I am the majority shareholder. I own 51% of the voting stock." Harrison gasped, struggling to breathe against Arlo's grip. "The board, we will initiate a hostile takeover. We will bleed you dry. Try it," Arlo whispered, a terrifying smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Try to take it from me. I will liquidate the entire Reynolds Group. I will sell the tech division to our competitors in Tokyo. I will dissolve the real estate holdings. I will personally burn a 100-year-old empire to the bedrock, salt the earth, and sell the ashes just to watch you go bankrupt." Harrison stared at him, wide-eyed, finally realizing that Arlo wasn't bluffing. He was looking at a man who no longer cared about money. Arlo leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "That boy in there is my son. That Omega is the only thing in this world that matters to me. If you or anyone on your board ever approach them again, if you even speak their names in a boardroom, I won't send lawyers. I will come for you personally. Do you understand?" Harrison nodded frantically, his face pale and sweating. Arlo released him in disgust. Harrison slumped against the wall, straightening his tie with shaking hands. The two security guards quickly helped him toward the stairs. "I am stepping down as CEO," Arlo called out after them, his voice echoing in the stairwell. "My lawyers will send the restructuring paperwork tomorrow. Don't ever come back to Seattle." Arlo slammed the apartment door shut. He locked the deadbolt. He stood there for a long moment, facing the heavy wooden door, his chest heaving as the adrenaline slowly ebbed. I stood in the kitchen, completely stunned. 4 years ago, Arlo had sacrificed me to save his empire. Today, he had sacrificed his empire without a second thought to save me. Arlo turned around slowly. He looked at me, a profound, heavy exhaustion settling over his features. "I'm sorry they found you. I'm sorry you had to hear that." "You just quit," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You just gave up the Reynolds Group." Arlo let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He walked into the living room and sank into the armchair opposite the couch. "It was never mine, Leo. It was a cage my father built. I just finally found the key to unlock the door." He looked at Toby, who was watching him with wide, curious gray eyes. Then Arlo looked at me. "I have nothing tying me to Chicago anymore," Arlo said quietly. "I'm staying here. You don't have to let me into your bed, Leo. You don't have to wear my ring. But I am not walking away again. I am going to stand right here until you realize I'm not going anywhere. Healing is not a cinematic event. It doesn't happen during a sweeping orchestral score in the rain. It happens in quiet, unremarkable increments. It happens on Tuesday afternoons and Sunday mornings, 6 months past. Arlo kept his word. He formally resigned as CEO of the Reynolds Group, retaining his equity but transferring all voting power and daily operations to a blind trust. He traded his glass tower in Chicago for a modest brick office in downtown Seattle, managing his own private investments. He traded his bespoke suits for dark denim and wool sweaters. He became a fixture in our lives, but he let me dictate the pace. It started with Sunday dinners. Arlo would come over, bringing groceries, and cook. Turns out, the billionaire was a surprisingly competent chef. Toby, who had initially treated Arlo like an interesting biological study, slowly began to treat him like a fixture. "Arlo, the soup lacks salt," Toby observed one evening, sitting at the small kitchen table, swinging his legs. Arlo, standing at the stove, smiled softly. He didn't patronize him. He grabbed the salt shaker. "My apologies. I'll adjust the seasoning. How was daycare?" "Liam let me sit in the excavator today," Toby reported proudly. Arlo shot me a look over his shoulder, a raised eyebrow. I just shrugged, sipping my wine. "Liam is a very responsible heavy machinery operator." It was easy. It was normal. It was everything I had never dared to hope for when I was 22 and standing in that cathedral. The anger I had held onto for 4 years didn't vanish overnight. There were still days when the scent of his cedar made my chest tighten with phantom grief. There were still nights when I woke up terrified that he had left, only to look out the window and see his car parked on the street. But those days became less frequent. The ice melted, drop by drop, replaced by a quiet, steady foundation of trust. In April, the Seattle rain finally gave way to a crisp, bright spring. We were at a park near the waterfront. Toby was running across the grass, aggressively flying a red kite that Arlo had bought him. Arlo and I were sitting on a wooden bench, watching him. The air smelled like salt water, blooming cherry blossoms, and Arlo's calm, relaxed cedar. "He's getting tall," Arlo murmured, leaning back against the bench. Our shoulders were brushing. "He's going to be as big as you," I noted, watching Toby trip over his own feet, instantly correct his balance, and keep running. "God help the world when he hits puberty." Arlo chuckled, a low, warm sound that vibrated against my side. He turned his head, looking at me. The gray eyes that had once looked so dead and hollowed out at the altar were now bright, clear, and relentlessly focused on me. He shifted slightly, turning his body toward me. He reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. The touch was electric, sending a warm, heavy shiver down my spine. My omega instincts, suppressed for so long, practically purred at the contact. "Leo?" Arlo said softly. "Yeah," I replied, holding his gaze. "I bought a house," he said. I blinked. "Oh, congratulations. Where?" "About 20 minutes from here, near the Sound. It has a big backyard, a good school district, a large kitchen." He paused, his thumb gently stroking my jawline. "It's empty, and it's going to stay empty unless you and Toby want to fill it." I looked at him. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't issuing a corporate mandate. He was asking. He was entirely at my mercy. "Are you asking me to move in with you?" I asked, my heart picking up a sudden, heavy rhythm. "No," Arlo said gently. "I'm asking for permission to court you. Properly. I want to take you on a date. I want to bring you flowers that you don't throw in the trash. I want to earn the right to ask you to move in with me." He leaned in closer. His scent wrapped around me, a thick, protective blanket of cedar and warmth. "I want to do it right this time, Leo. From the beginning, I want to earn you." I looked past him, watching Toby laughing as the red kite caught a strong updraft, soaring high into the clear blue sky. I looked back at the man who had broken me, and the man who had spent the last 6 months quietly, painstakingly putting the pieces back together. I didn't need a cathedral. I didn't need white linen or a board of directors' approval. I just needed him to stay. I leaned forward, closing the final inch between us, and pressed my lips against his. Arlo inhaled sharply, his hands instantly coming up to cup my face, holding me like I was something fragile and infinitely precious. He kissed me back with a slow, devastating tenderness that tasted like apology, promise, and coming home. When we finally pulled apart, Arlo's forehead rested against mine. He was smiling, a real, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. "So," I whispered, my lips brushing his, "where are you taking me for dinner?" Thank you for listening to this emotional journey. If Leo and Toby's story struck a chord with you, or if you loved seeing exactly how Arlo handled the ultimate consequences of his actions and fought for his family, please hit the like button and share this video with your fellow drama lovers. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you won't miss the next amazing stories we bring to life. Drop a comment below. Did Arlo do enough to earn his second chance? See you in the next video.